What's up, Spice Heads? Welcome back to another great video meetup. It's been a little while. Hope you all have been doing well and that your 2020 is off to a good start. We've got a great show for y'all today. We're going to be talking all about SQL licensing and demystifying and hopefully you guys preventing you guys from losing more of your hair. For more on this, we have a great panel, or we have a great expert for y'all today from Trusted Tech. Let's go ahead and meet him. He's the Director of Operations for Trusted Tech team out in California. Please welcome back Mr. David Spencer to the show. David, how's it going today?
It's going good. It is a sunny 75 here in California, so cannot complain.
Very cool. Yes, we've got a lot of folks in chat from the Midwest talking about negative degrees, and we're just going to flaunt our sunny weather in their faces while we can until it turns hot in the summer and they get to laugh at us back.
Oh yeah.
But cool. Thank you for joining us. David, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do for Trusted Tech, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Justin, like you said, I'm Director of Operations. That can mean a lot of different things at a lot of different places, but here what it means is I make sure everyone can do their jobs on the day-to-day. Also make sure that anyone who interacts with us has a smooth experience. So that means, figuring out what people need, and then making sure that the staff here is equipped to do so. So that ends up meaning I have to get a lot of that licensing knowledge, get it out to our staff so we can help people.
All right, very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We've got a lot to talk about, so don't go anywhere. But before we get started, I did want to cover a few housekeeping items. Of course, if you do have questions for David, we're going to be taking them later on in the show, so make sure you get that Q&A widget down below. If you have any questions for us, you can ask us there. Also, we've got a lot of great resources that Trusted Tech has provided, including a SQL licensing calculator as an Excel sheet, which is pretty cool. Just a heads up, yeah, if you don't have Excel, I believe it does still work as a Google spreadsheet, but I don't think the right things are protected, so your experience may vary a little bit. So hopefully you've got that Excel license. And if not, then David can probably help you out with that as well. And just wanted to give a special shout out to chat. We've got a lot of our favorite folks, love always seeing, including Eagle Mitchell, a little IT guy, Shells TX, how's it going, everybody? Just of course, if you do participate in chat, make sure that you adhere to our community guidelines and make sure that everyone's having a positive and professional experience. And as a special thank you for hanging out with us today. Not one, but two of y'all are going to be walking away with the Holy Stone HS700D drone with 2K FHD camera, live video, and GPS, which is good because you don't want to lose it. So make sure to stick around until after the event. We'll be announcing the winners of our prizes as well as taking your questions. Well, let's go ahead and get started into it, David. SQL 2019 is out. For those folks that are either running older versions of SQL or possibly, coming to SQL new but have had experience with previous versions in the past, are there things that we need to be aware of that are new for 2019?
Yeah. So SQL 2019, they have released a few new features. Overall, SQL as a product doesn't change too much, but obviously every iteration they're going to want to give you some new bells and whistles. With 2019, you have the big data clusters, you have the intelligent query processing, I'll sit here for 20 minutes reading off the features. That's one of the things I wanted to link. So in the sidebar, you can actually view the full rundown of all the features that are available. On top of that, Linux support is enhanced. It first came out with SQL 2016 as a really kind of weak release. They improved on it in 2017, now 2019. It's a full-blown release. You can install everything in Linux. The reason why that is actually really important, because it removes the OS licensing cost, because you can install into an open source operating system. So it definitely saves you a lot of money instead of, you won't have to get both Windows Server and SQL Server. So that does help you out. Moving on, you have the additions. And once again, SQL hasn't changed much since the release of 2016. We still have the same additions. Choosing the addition that suits your needs is going to be all based on feature requirements. So it's going to determine, what you need, what pieces you need in SQL, whether you're going to go Express, Standard, Enterprise. The biggest piece that is now in SQL Standard that was in SQL Enterprise before was the transparent data encryption feature. When speaking with customers, this was probably the feature 9 times out of 10 that drove people into SQL Enterprise, which is pretty expensive to start out. So now that Microsoft put this into the standard version, it'll save a ton of people some money, especially if you're actually upgrading from a 2016, 2017 version. You can actually take advantage of standard moving forward. So that is huge.
Cool.
But so yeah, with the additions, you got the Express, you got the Standard, you got the Enterprise. Those are the mainstream editions. The Express is basically just an intro version. It's really good for lightweight use. It's free and it's valid for production. That means you can use it in for-profit environment. Then the cap is just a 10 gigabyte per database. So once you exceed that, then you need to move to the paid licensing, which is then Standard, which there again is just feature-based. And then you also have the scaling limits increase, so you can use more processing power. Basically just opens up once your application or database gets a little larger. All of those features, the full breakdown between the additions and the scaling limits, are also a link in the sidebar. So when you're evaluating, you can use that for reference to figure out, okay, this is the addition I need to go with. And then obviously then you move up to Enterprise. That's just fully unlocked, and you can pretty much do anything with it. There are a few other additions, but the one other one I'll drop in is Developer, because this is actually a really, really useful tool when you're doing any type of migration. You can't use it in production environment because it's a free version, but it's actually unlocked in the same way that Enterprise is. So if you're doing something like going from Enterprise 2016 to Standard 2017, you can actually upgrade into Developer, rip out those Enterprise features that you don't need, and then you'd be able to upgrade into Standard. So it's a really useful, almost like Swiss Army knife type of tool. So it's really, really helpful, and I recommend it all the time.
Cool. Awesome. So given that the feature set is relevant, I mean, there are some new perks. I mean, so what do you feel are, in your opinion, some of the main reasons folks would be looking at upgrading? Is it the features? Would it be kind of end of service, expiring hardware, move to cloud? What are you guys seeing as some of the biggest drivers?
The biggest driver is always going to be the software compatibility. So obviously, when you're working with SQL, you're either developing your own application, which isn't as common, or you're working with a software provider. A lot of these software providers, if they're an enterprise level company, like a major accounting software or something, then once the newest version's out, then they're going to be ready for it. But if you're working with a smaller provider, a lot of times they're only going to support maybe SQL 2014 through 2016. And so they're going to have a smaller window of what version of SQL you can use. Generally, when we see people need to upgrade, they'll say, oh, my software only supports, 16 through 19 now. I'm on 2014. I got to upgrade it. What do I do? So that's how those conversations are always started, just the compatibility of what software SQL's running for you.
All right, cool. All right, let's get into the licensing, which is trusted text bread and butter. What do we need to know about licensing for SQL 2019?
Well, so it hasn't changed for a few years, but honestly, it still seems crazy complicated. So I was trying to have the same conversation with customers, but there's 2 licensing models. There's what you call the server cal model, and then the core model. There is no functional difference between the two. Doesn't matter, which one you end up going with. If you purchase it, you get SQL, and everything will work as intended. With these 2 models, I kind of refer to it as the nobody gets left behind approach to licensing, where the goal here is to figure out what's going to be what licensing route is going to be the cost effective for you over time, not only now how your environment looks today, but also in future. So that being said, you kind of want to figure out how many users you're looking to utilize the application that SQL is running. And there's the user versus device licensing that we can go into too. Basically, if you have more users using less devices, then you'll want to go device licensing, and it's all just to make it cheaper. So for example, you have 20 people and they're only ever going to use an application on 5 systems. Well, 5 device counts is cheaper than 20 users, so that's how you would go that way. So you need to know how many people are going to be utilizing your application for how many systems. The second thing you need to know is how much processing power that your instance requires to run effectively. With those 2 things, now you're going to be able to figure out what licensing model you can use, what works for you, and then what's going to be cost effective. So the first one I like to talk about is the CAL model, the server CAL model. It's only available with SQL Server Standard. What it does is it relies on licensing the number of users plus the cost of the software. Back in the day when I was in math class, we learned linear equations. I don't know if you guys all remember that, but it's the simple, the y equals mx plus b, right? This is exactly what licensing the CAL model is, where y would be the total cost, m would be the cost per cal, x would be the number of cals you need, and then b would be the cost of the software. So you have that base cost, which is the cost of the software, and then plus the price of the cals plus the number that you have. So if you were to take a look at the licensing calculator that's in the sidebar there, you'll see as you change the inputs for how many users, you see the line, the linear equation going. What's great is the processing power with the CAL model is irrelevant unless you exceed the SQL Server, the standard cap, which is 24 cores per instance. But you're getting pretty powerful when you're getting to that point. So that usually works, or that model works best for like a closed system or with a lower number of users. So that's the server CAL model. Then you have the core model, which applies either to standard or enterprise, and it just relies on the processing power available to SQL. Now that's the key word, available, and I'll expand on that a little more in a bit. But it's licensed a little more simply, just based on the number of cores, and then the number of users are irrelevant here. So if you license via the core model, you could have 5 people or you could have 5,000. As long as it can run, then you're good to go. But overall, you're able to choose the model that's cost effective to your organization. That way, say you have a really small database, but a lot of users, you can kind of figure out something that works for what you're trying to do.
All right. So let's say that you decided that you do need to purchase SQL Server. What are the next steps then?
So number one, you want to figure out the platform that you're going to be running. Are you doing something on-prem? Are you looking to go through Azure, AWS, third-party solution? You also want to figure out the project. Is it going to be a permanent solution? Is it going to be temporary? That's going to drive how you're going to acquire SQL. The second step is going to be the version. Version as in the year version, whether that's 2019, 2017, 2016, like I was mentioning before. That's all going to be driven on compatibility with whatever software you're using. Inventory and accounting solutions are usually the ones that require legacy versions of SQL. We have people still coming in asking for 2012, 2008 R2, even though it's technically end of life as of last month. So, figuring out the version and then the platform, with that knowledge, then that's how you know the way you're going to acquire SQL. If you're looking to purchase it outright, say the job is permanent, Then you have either the retail option, which is usually a little bit cheaper, and you only get the version you purchase. So if you need SQL 2019, well, then that's all you get. That's all you have the option to install. That is either purchased through a partner or through Microsoft. Then you have the open business way of purchasing, which is an open license, which volume license. There's a lot of complication there. We actually have a prior VMU. We ripped that all apart. But for simplicity's sake, open license, usually a little more expensive, but you do get the downgrade rights. So if you have that software compatibility that you need to adhere to, you could purchase SQL 2019, an open license installed, say 2014 today, but then a year from down the road, you can install 19. So it gives you more flexibility. Those are purchased through a partner, and then you can also add software assurance, which I'll go into a little more later. On top of that, then if you're not going to buy it outright, or the project isn't permanent, you can go with the temporary procurement channel. You can go something like Open Value, which is a little bit cheaper, but it'll be more expensive over time. It's kind of like, if you lease a car, well, if you'd want to keep making payments, it may end up being, more expensive over time. So you can go with something like that, or you can actually rent SQL licensing. This is something that's becoming more prevalent through third-party providers. So you can do a very similar thing in AWS. You can actually do it in Azure as well. So if you want to set up a SQL database within Azure, you can do so. That way you don't have that large cost up front, but you can actually just rent the licensing over time, and the moment project ends, you can be good to go. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of, buying SQL, acquiring it, and then using it for, you can cater your purchasing towards the way you want to use it.
All right. Let's go on next to compliance. Now, we've heard about SQL Server, there are issues around compliance that folks ought to be aware of. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so compliance is a big thing, especially with SQL Server. With Microsoft products, when you're licensing in the commercial environment, Microsoft likes to kind of grant some leeway in terms of installation. I think the last thing anyone wants is to have a stoppage in business, right? So, say you hire a new person on, there's a project they need to get done, right away, and then, oh no, you don't have the licensing, you can't do anything, you're stuck. No one wants that, even Microsoft. So what they do is there's some flexibility, so you can actually, take care of what you need to do and then turn around later and go get the licensing you need. So the positive, is you can work around short change notices and you can adapt without causing business interruption. Negative there, obviously, is you can get yourself out of compliance. You add a bunch of users, then you don't go turn around and buy the cows, well, you're going to be out of compliance. So there's some positive and negative there. But the way that it applies to SQL, it really matters on choosing your licensing model and choosing it up front. So during conversations we have with customers, we not only ask about, hey, how many users do you have right now? How many cores does your instance need to run effectively? We don't just spit it out for you. That's part of the reason in that calculator, if you take a look, there's one section where it says your estimate, which is what you're using now, and then it actually shows you what the cost-effective cutoff is. So you can tell, okay, well, if I have 10 users right now, but hey, you might hire on some more bodies later, you'll be able to know, hey, am I going to surpass that cost-effective cutoff? So, you start with a little bit, but say you want to add, hundreds of people later, and you start with the server cal model, guess what? Like, you're going to be spending a lot of money staying in compliance, whereas if you just went core in the beginning, be a lot cheaper for you. So figuring out how that applies, not only now and future is really important. But when we additionally talking about compliance, there's a lot of misconceptions. We hear it all the time. The biggest one I always want to talk about this first is it's called multiplexing. There's even a Microsoft document on it. If you Google multiplexing, it's the very first thing that comes up. We've heard a lot of smaller software companies advise their clients incorrectly based on this concept. What it's defined as is pooling queries. So if you say you have an application and then you have SQL, if you have an application server in between, if you route all those queries through an application server, if you're looking at the reporting from SQL, it'll show, oh, everything's coming from one place. A lot of software companies will tell you that means you only need one cow, which is probably the worst thing they can say because it has you choose the wrong model and then be out of compliance. Verbatim in that multiplexing document I'm referencing, it says, if you route requests through an application server, it does not affect your licensing cost. So that's a big thing that gets people in trouble, and they come to us all the time, whether they're in an audit or they just hired a new IT guy who's trying to detangle the mess of all the software, and they realize, oh no, this is what happened. So it does come up a lot, unfortunately. That's why we always try, give people all the information they can beforehand, make people, make sure you're knowledgeable about, what you're getting into with SQL, because unfortunately it's just not buying a software anymore.
So let's talk about cost next. Even with the licensing explained, like you did earlier, for some organizations that could still be a little bit out of their reach. Can you talk about what are folks' options if they are concerned about the cost to run SQL?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're evaluating your environment and the cost seems extreme, then there's probably something that was missed. There's usually a lot of lesser known options you can take to reduce your licensing costs while also staying in compliance. I actually had a customer reach out the other day, and then we determined that, hey, their database is open facing. They had to go license for the core model, and his response was, well, that's crazy. That's way too much. And we're talking about a few $1,000s, which is expensive. But then he mentioned how, well, he's going to have his whole team redo what they were doing. And so my thought was, well, if you have a whole team, then the cost is probably in the right ballpark. But yeah, so the cost is usually going to try and be scaled towards what how big your project is. But there are a bunch of ways to reduce cost. Earlier I mentioned that when you're licensing via the core model, you need to license based on the processing power that's available to your instance. This is where virtualization comes in. I can't stress this enough. Pretty much every single SQL installation should always be run in a virtualized environment because there's so much more control over the management aspect of it. The first thing that we always say is, hey, virtualize SQL, because if you do so, you can control the processing power it has access to. Therefore, the licensing solution becomes scalable. If you install SQL directly in a physical server, say, you have to license everything that physical server has access to. So if you're talking like a 16-core environment, you're talking a few tens of thousands of dollars. But if you virtualize that, and you can cut it all the way down to the minimum of 4 cores. So it definitely can be really useful virtualizing. So on the scalability piece too, if you license with 4 cores, and then over time your user base spins up, you add more, and then it starts to slow down, guess what? You can tweak the amount of cores that VM has access to, turn around, buy more licensing. Now it's a scalable solution. Now, you spent, a few $1,000s maybe in the beginning of the project a year ago. Now you're spending just a little bit more, but you don't have to do all of it up front. And that makes it a lot easier to adapt. So virtualization, huge. Second is controlling your user base. So if you're looking at initially licensing One of the things that Microsoft says, and it says it in the licensing document, it says the core model of licensing is appropriate when quote, the number of users / devices cannot be counted easily. That's the verbatim explanation. So what we've kind of advised people is if you can take steps to enforce or control your user count, it opens up the CAL model as a licensing option. One of the prime examples we use is if you have SQL running, say, the search behind a website. If that website is fully just open facing, that means you can't count your users, meaning you have to go core model, which it's expensive to start out. It's a few $1,000s to start out. But if you were to then take that site, put it behind a username password, and force people to log in to do it, well, then you know who has access, and you can control the users. Therefore, it actually opens up the CAL model and can save you a few $1,000s. So just making a small operational change can adjust the way you adjust your options for licensing. The other piece that I usually talk about as far as reducing cost is utilizing the software assurance benefits. If you're getting SQL through a volume licensing channel, you have benefits like the failover rights, which allow you to install SQL into a passive instance on a secondary server instead of paying for a second server all over again. Also, the Azure hybrid benefit. This is a big one, especially with the prevalence of Azure. If you licensed an environment via the core model with software assurance, you can actually show proof of purchase and you get reduced rates for either the general purpose Azure SQL databases or the SQL integration services. I believe it translates to, for every 4 cores of software assurance you purchase, you get basically 1 core worth free in Azure, something like that. I'll double check it. But that info is available. It's listed under the Azure hybrid benefit. But it basically makes it, it helps if you are doing a slower migration from a purely on-prem environment into something that's hybridized.
All right. Very cool. Let's talk next about upgrading. So you mentioned this earlier, folks that are running older versions like 2014 and software requirements, you said, are one of the bigger reasons why folks do upgrade. So if you are in that situation, what do folks need to know?
Yeah, so there's a bit of good news. I always like to tell people this. The process behind upgrading SQL is probably one of the easier within the Microsoft product sphere. I have seen upgrades from older versions of Office take longer than SQL. As long as fingers crossed, everything goes well. You're talking usually you can do an upgrade from say SQL 2014 and 2019 within a couple hours. Also, whenever you're doing that upgrade, it always presents you with an opportunity to reevaluate your licensing model. So say you previously were on core, that doesn't mean you need to license via core when you're upgrading. You can take a look and see, hey, you know what, is there a way to save some money? And then you can go that way, especially with, like I mentioned before, the transparent data encryption. So you go enterprise to standard, and you can definitely save yourself some money. The only bad news, I would say, if you haven't procured Microsoft stuff in a while, they completely removed all those upgrade products they used to have when you could get things probably about half the price if you had a prior version. We still have people call in asking about that stuff. Oh, I have, Office 2013. Can I get it cheaper? It's like, no, sorry. So, cost-wise, you're looking at the same cost to procure SQL as someone who is looking to purchase it for the first time. The only real exception to that is there's this thing called step-up licensing. So if you're going from, or if you have standard core licensing and you go, you know what, shoot, I need some enterprise stuff, there's basically cheaper licensing that available that kind of makes it at the end of the day the same cost.
Right. And then one last question before we go to the ones from the audience. So tell us a little bit more about how Trusted Tech gets involved with this process. How do you guys help your clients, wade through this process in addition to providing the expertise that you just provided to us today?
Yeah, so people know us mostly as a reseller, but we do like to take it a step further than that. Whenever people call in or reach out to us, we want to spend the time and help evaluate your environment and point out those things, like I've mentioned here on the thing today, that will kind of help you, cut costs or future-proof your environment. We want you to kind of leverage the knowledge we have and the experience to make everything cost effective and make sure you can make well thought out decisions. We kind of use these consultations that we have. They're complimentary. We don't charge to have a conversation with you and figure out what works best for you. But we kind of do it to establish a business relationship. We try and invest in you, that way you'll continue working with us. At the end of the day, honestly, having these conversations, people tend to just come back to us even if they find it cheaper elsewhere, because they know, hey, we're going to be here to continue to help them out, on their purchasing journey.
All right, very cool. We've got a lot of great questions from the audience. We'll go ahead and start with a couple. One from Eagle Mitchell. What's going on, Eagle? Wants to know, I have some consultants pushing us hard to build up a load balancing SQL server or a load balance SQL server, but is afraid of the cost implications for licensing. Is that, how do you guys typically handle load balancing licenses? Is that like a 1-for-1? Is it double the cost if you are going to run load balance?
Yeah, it is. Because if you're running load balancing, you're not able to leverage any of like the failover benefits, because those are only available if you're installing on a passive server. So yeah, with that, you would have to license 2 servers outright, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question is, so with Trusted Tech, from Percussive Maintenance, do you guys offer software assurance as part of your licensing? How does that work in relation to you guys?
Yeah, so we do offer software assurance with all of our licensing. Whenever we have these consultations, we'll always take a look and ask about the environment. At the end of the day, if we determine that software assurance is something you need, it's going to be cost effective for you, then we'll end up quoting you on pretty much exactly what you need. So the option is always there. I would say whenever we have those people come in, those conversations happen, a lot of the times people come in and say, hey, I need this in software assurance. And honestly, 4 to 5 times, they don't actually. Mm-hmm. But, at the end of the day, yeah, if we determine together that is what you need, that is always an option. Software assurance, when we're talking about going through a channel like Open Business, it does add a significant amount of cost on. It adds about 50% cost on top, and it does require renewal. So we really always want to make sure that software assurance is something you need beforehand, because the cost-effective point there ends up being 4 years. So say you're looking at utilizing or running something where you have an active passive server. If you're going to stay on a version of SQL for a long time, you could start off and you could license the single server with software assurance, but then you'd add 50% cost after 2 years. Then at 4 years, another 50%. But then if you were to license both servers outright, and just keep those, that would actually be cheaper in the long run after the 4-year mark. So usually, as long as someone's taking advantage of at least 2 software assurance benefits, it usually makes it cost effective.
Okay. Yeah. And so we've also even got a question from Shells TX. Do you find that software assurance is worth it? Obviously, you said that it does depend. So, I mean, is it pretty obvious if you need software assurance and that it is worth the cost? Do people buy it just in case something comes up later? What can you tell us about it?
Yeah. So It's always going to be on a case-by-case basis. I
Hmm.
would say the amount of people who think they need software assurance is much greater than the amount of people that actually need it.
Hmm.
Like I said, usually we try and look for at least two reasons to have it. Whether it's something like upgrade rights to, that's one thing that software assurance gives you, is it allows you to install a new version if it comes out while your software assurance is active. And on top of that, you can always not renew your software assurance. So if you
Hmm.
so a lot of times you will see a spike in customers acquiring software assurance right before a new release of software, not just SQL, but pretty much anything. Uh, if you were to buy, say, SQL Server 2017 a month before 2019 came out, if you bought without software assurance, you're only going to ever be able to install 2017. If you buy it with,
Hmm.
you'd be able to install 19 when it comes out. So we do see that spike right at that time, but it's always going to be on a per basis.
Hmm. Okay. Um, we've got a couple of folks asking, about the core model. Spicehead UX9 UGW and Kenneth 1810 are basically saying if you're running it on a virtual machine that happens to have 8 or 10 cores, can you restrict SQL to say only use 4 cores in order to save on the licensing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the biggest reason why we tell people to virtualize, because you don't have to allocate everything that the physical server has towards the VM, and then you only ever have to license what the VM has access to. So with the
Hmm.
core model, you have to license a minimum of 4 cores. So
Okay.
if you have, say, a 16-core server, you would want to spin up a VM, put 4 cores in it, then you put SQL in there, and then guess what? You only have to license 4 cores. 6 months down the road, you go, hey, this is a little slow. I'm going to go ahead and up the juice that it has. Then you would turn around, buy the licensing. That's how it becomes the scalable solution, and it can actually be cost effective.
All right. This is an interesting question from Nathan13410. He's looking at an HP Hyper Converged deployment. Do you happen to know, or do you guys speak to how Hyper Converged licensing works for SQL?
That I don't know, but I have some resources. I'll go ahead and DM you. I'll do a little research and DM you after. I'll
Perfect.
get that info for you.
Awesome. Appreciate it, David. Okay, so I think you kind of covered this a little earlier, but Percussive Maintenance wants to know what counts as a user for a user cal. Do they have a device cal for SQL in the same way that they do for Windows?
Yeah, they do. So, when we're talking about users and devices, we're talking about unique. So, not concurrent. This is a big, actually, misconception that comes in. People think, oh, well, you know what? I only ever have 10 people in an office at a time, even though I have 30 employees. Does that mean I can go 10 user counts? No, it doesn't. So, talking about unique access. So, um, so anything that would qualify to be counted and need for a count is going to be the source of any query. Um, so if you
Okay.
have, a shop, you have SQL running behind an application, so you have a bunch of tablets around the office. Any of those would count, and then also any unique user login ever using that would count as a user. So that's what you would have to count in order to figure out how many cals you need.
Okay. Another good question for Percussive Maintenance. Is the only difference between cal and core licensing just the cost? Are there any other differences or benefits?
It's just cost. Well, cost and scalability. Um,
Mhm.
so there's no functional difference between the software. So, if you go one route or the other, your application is never going to know. So it's just the whole goal of deciding between the two models. It's just figuring out honestly what's going to be cheaper for you, not only now and in the long run. So that's why we always try to have those really thorough reviews of the environment. Hey, what are you doing with this today? What does it look like in a year from now? Are you going to cross that cost effective threshold? Because it's all based on cost. Anything with features, you're looking at going up in different editions. Um, Obviously, when we're talking about the Cal model versus core model as well. It does only apply to standard because enterprise licensing via SQL Enterprise is only available through the core model. But yeah, so it's just cost.
Okay. This is a good question from Granite Geek. Can you change from Cal to core very easily if you determine that the alternative licensing model actually suits you better?
Easily, yes. Cheaply, no. Yeah, so we've had people do this. They originally purchased go with the Cal model. They have a small number of users. They reach back out to us, a year and a half later, and now they have 500. We go, okay, well, basically you kind of have to look at relicense the environment in totality. So basically any cost you spent on the prior licensing model is just null and void. It doesn't count. So that's why there's such a stress on figuring out what's the best model at the start for you.
Okay. All right. Another good question. This one is coming from Geek Girl in Florida. So if I anticipate migrating the server to a different host, do I also need to buy and maintain software assurance in addition to the license?
So if you're doing a hard cutover, no, you don't. But there's always kind of a grace period that you have when you're doing stuff like this. So if you're going from an old hardware to a new one and you're moving SQL over, as long as you're not running both for a long time, then you're good to go. This is actually a perfect situation where I suggest using developer. So you could actually do a migration from the old hardware and then migrate it into developer in the new one. The moment you have everything good to go, then you just upgrade from developer into standard or what have you. But no, you don't need to license entirely new environment if the intent is to just move it off that and stop using it on the original hardware. The same theory kind of applies if you have with employees. So you need CALs for employees that you have using an application. If you fire Joe on Monday and you hire Steve on Tuesday, you don't need to buy another CAL just because you had another person start, because that person's no longer using it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, I'm glad you said that, because we had a question from Licensing is a Pain, who also asked about replacing users who leave the company. So cool. All right, we've got a couple of other questions. Folks want to know around the different editions. AKA Jeff wants to know, why can't you just use the SQL Server Developer Edition as a production SQL Server? And Percussive Maintenance wants to know this is Kirk wants to know, how long can you use test dev before you have to purchase the licenses?
So when we're talking about production and non-production, it's not very strictly defined. So if you, like I said, SQL Developer Edition, it's fully unlocked. Technically, yeah, if you spun it up, you could use it in a production environment and it's going to work. But when you do that, then you're out of compliance. And then if basically Microsoft ever requests an audit from you, then obviously then you'd have problems because you're not paying for the licensing that you need. So it's in a sense, it's kind of an honor system a little bit, but then also, if you do that, then eventually you will get picked up on. It is just going to happen. So it's technically usable, but it's obviously not advised, because then the licensing police make them knocking. Justin, can you repeat the second half of that question?
Just kind of same thing. So how long can you use test and dev before you need to actually purchase the licensing? Or
Okay.
what's the restriction on that?
So as long as you can define it as development, whether it's pre-production, staging, testing, as long as you can define it as such, then you can do it perpetually. Pretty much anyone we have a lot of students even come in and say, hey, and they come in asking to buy SQL Server from us, and then we turn around and go, okay, what are you doing this for? I just want to try it out at home. I have a class. Okay, like, well, we could sell it to you, but we're not going to do that. Just use the developer edition. It's not production. You can play around with it. There you go. So there's no time limit on it. It's kind of still relies on the honor system.
Okay. All right, let's go. Oh, so we got a couple of folks, Michael 36933, and then also I think because of maintenance also it's about high availability licensing. Can you talk to us about how that is licensed?
Yeah, so high availability. Okay, let me pull it up. I have my handy dandy book right here. That's one thing I always try. I know it's right here. If I can pull it up easily, I will. I always try and make sure to give no answer as opposed to the wrong answer. I don't remember that piece offhand. Let me do this. Let me get back to you, and I'll DM you.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Granite Geek wants to know, how do I determine if I have enough CALs?
Ooh, so there's a couple ways to do so. One is you kind of have to know your application and know who's using it. You can go the the prehistoric method of actually walking around and counting the devices and counting users. The other way you can figure it out is utilizing SQL Server reporting services, or SSRS. The reporting services, if you ever have SQL or you have it licensed, whether it's standard, enterprise, express, SSRS is always just a free add-on you can add into SQL to kind of tell you what you're utilizing. But you also have to know it can be a pitfall because the reporting won't necessarily tell you exactly how many CALs you need. The perfect example is that multiplexing scenario I was talking about. If you use multiplexing where you route queries through an application server, well, if you look at reporting services for that instance, it's going to tell you, oh, there's only one user. Well, that's wrong because you have all these people, doing all these things. So you can kind of rely on the reporting services to tell you, so long as you don't have something that would invalidate that data.
All right, cool. Jay Leroy wants to know, so the spreadsheet has pricing for standard. Do you guys have something for enterprise licensing, or is it kind of a similar model, or do you guys have a separate resource for that, or is that something you're working on?
So in order to keep this thing simple, we only built in the standard to it. However, I do have the source, so I can go ahead and update that and get it out to you. But the thing with the enterprise licensing as well, the CAL model isn't an option. So you're talking just about the core model. So there's no comparison to do. That's another reason we kind of left it out. Basically, it's just a strict cost per 2 core pack, minimum of 4, and then you figure out how much you need. But I'd be glad to update that a little bit and or at least DM you over some resources after the fact.
Appreciate it. All right. We got some folks just wanting to know more about Trusted Tech. Little IT guy wants to know, how do you guys keep your prices so low? Are you able to share with us the secret sauce?
Yeah. So like I've mentioned a few times throughout this, is we try and focus on relationships. At any company I've ever worked at that's been selling anything, we have the most established relationships here that we've ever had. We usually greet people calling in by first name. With that, honestly, you kind of eliminate marketing costs. I don't know if you guys know, but marketing on the internet can be extremely expensive, and it's even more expensive when you are paying for every single person who comes through the door. So by getting to know people and kind of establishing relationships, we can then, when people return and they come back, we don't have to pay that cost the second, the third, the fourth, or the 800th time they come back. So it makes it easier, and then we can turn around, we can pass on those savings.
All right. And then Prakash Menon wants to know, what benefits are there going with trusted tech versus a different third party?
So if you're talking about strictly price, we're not going to win it every time. But what we can promise is people like me are going to be the ones that are going to be picking up the phone. We're not, we give you real answers. We do, research for you. We do have a pretty tight knit team here, but they're very knowledgeable and self-sufficient. We don't rely on boilerplate answers for support queries. We try to figure out what problem you may actually be having to deal with. It's kind of like going somewhere where you know that you have someone to call just in case versus going to Walmart and buying something, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the advantage is, we establish a relationship with you, continue to work with you, and we can be a resource not only for, Microsoft products, but really any of the other product lines that we carry. So it's kind of like the, large business pricing, but the small business experience.
All right, very cool. I'm looking over the questions. We'll take one more from Jan4211. What is the oldest edition of SQL that can be upgraded to 2019?
So the oldest edition that can be easily upgraded is 2005. Now, obviously, SQL as a product doesn't change too much. It does change some. If you're talking about doing just the simple in-place upgrade, 2005 will do it. We usually recommend don't, making that large jump all at once, but usually, maybe jumping up 3 versions. So maybe 2005 to 2008 R2, then 08 R2 to 14, making sure, and then to 19. Obviously, the longer of a jump you make, the more likely it is you'll have problems, but it's not too bad. And then you also obviously always have the kind of the failover of just pulling out the database and importing it into a newer version of SQL. So there's a pretty good amount of flexibility when it comes to upgrades.
All right, very cool. I think we've got most of the questions, at least in some form or fashion. David, is there anything else that you have for our audience as far as final takeaways or things to think about and keep with you as folks go on with the rest of their day?
When it comes to the licensing piece, I know I say this every time, but always do your diligence and do your research. You don't want to be the guy that spends a few $1,000s and realizes, I should have gone back and done it the other way, because that just sucks, honestly. Plus, you usually don't look too good if you spend money that way. Other than that, I would honestly suggest taking a look at some of the additional software assurance benefits that are available. There's a ton that I didn't go over. I didn't want to just read a laundry list of stuff, but I've done that before and it doesn't go over too well. So I'm trying to improve here. But yeah, so I would definitely take advantage and look at the resources that I sent over. But I would say just kind of try to stay up to date on what the main new things that come out with SQL, because every once in a while there can be some game changers. Like specifically, I would say the biggest one lately is the Linux support. Because you can put it in Linux. A lot of people are just a little happier there than in Windows.
All right, great. Well, thanks again, David, for hopping on with us. You handled all the questions great, so appreciate you coming on and hanging out with us today. I did also want to thank everyone for asking all those great questions. We had a lot of questions. We didn't answer each of them individually. We tried to get as many as the same types of questions as possible. But thanks for everyone for hanging out with us today. It's now time to announce the winner of our prizes. So two all are going to be winning the Holy Stone drone with camera and GPS. And those winners are Jay Leroy and Sam Smart 84. Congratulations, Jay Leroy and Sam Smart 84. Y'all are both the winners of our drone prize today. Please send a private message to David S. in the community and let him know where you would like those prizes shipped, and let us know how you like it. Take some cool videos and send them to us, please. No one ever sends us cool stuff. Like, we send you guys cool stuff and no one ever shows us what they do with it. So please do that. David, again, big thank you to you as well as this Trusted Tech for sponsoring today's event. We hope to hear from you guys again in the near future. For more information about other shows that we've got coming up, make sure to click that orange button that says click here for upcoming shows, or stick around until after the presentation ends. And until next time, y'all, stay safe, keep it spicy. We will see y'all back here next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.